Towards the late 1980s, new innovative filmmakers continued to draw inspiration from 50s classics. In 1988, a trio of special effects artists called the Chiodo Brothers made their first feature film. Drawing on 50s horror traditions, it focused on a small American town being invaded by aliens from outer space. But these aliens also happened to look like terrifying clowns. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a young New Zealand director called Peter Jackson had been working on a horror film for 4 years with his mates about aliens invading Wellington and eating human beings.
The planet will tremble under the full might of the Lord Clown, the restaurant.
This tiny budget movie wasn't just a huge breakthrough for its director, but it was also, at the time, one of the most grotesque splatter movies ever made.
I got a chucky bit.
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of alien horror, and we discuss bad taste and killer clowns from outer space. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 7th series exploring the evolution of alien, cosmic, and sci-fi horror, and this is part 17. This week, it's a really fun double bill. As I mentioned in that intro there, we're going to be discussing killer clowns from outer space and bad taste in spoilerific detail. Please give these films a watch before listening to our discussions. They are incredibly fun. So later on in the second half of this episode, I will be joined by friend of the pod, Jen Handorf, to discuss killer clowns from outer space. But first, let's get into Peter Jackson's bad taste. I've got a brand new guest joining me to discuss this movie. She is the executive editor of features at IGN, horror journalist, games journalist, movie journalist, all-round legend. She hails from New Zealand but lives over in San Francisco. Welcome to the podcast, Lucy O'Brien. Hello, Lucy.
Hello, Mike. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm a long-time listener, first-time guest.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much. That's very flattering. And especially from somebody like you, Lucy, who I very much admire. So thank you so much for being here. And first of all, just if there's anyone out there listening who doesn't know anything about you, just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm the executive editor of features at IGN, which means I look after all of our feature content, whether that be about video games or movies or TV, across, the written word and video and all sorts of things like that. So it's a big, all-encompassing job, but it's a lot of fun. It opens up a lot of very interesting talents and passions and interviews and all that sort of thing. So, and I get to talk about horror and get to edit people talking about horror, and it's a delight.
I love it. Yeah, I know. And it is a delight. It absolutely is. Tell me a little bit about your own history with the horror genre then. Have you always been a big horror fan?
I have been. My dad was the one who got me into horror. There's sometimes when you just have a parent that is very, very obsessed with the genre, it tends to spill down. And for me, that was very much the case. And he kind of gave me a sort of history of when I think I was probably 12, 13. He sort of sat me down. He was like, "You're ready." So it started off with things like Poltergeist, and then he showed me The Evil Dead. He fast forwarded through the tree scene. I remember that so vividly. He fast forwarded through that scene, but I got to watch everything else. And he was the one who introduced me to horror film, and he would read me horror short stories when I was a little kid as well. So he was definitely the one that instilled that love of the genre for me, and it's just never left me. It's just intensified, if anything.
I love it. Do you have a certain favorite type of horror movie, a favorite subgenre or anything like that, would you say?
Well, everyone says this, and I know that I'm just an old, record, but, honestly, just psychological horror for me is where my passions lie. And of course, I think that psychological horror is almost a genre in itself rather than a subgenre. And I think it's, certainly in modern horror these days, it's kind of the genre of the time. And we're certainly seeing, a lot of social issues are filtered through this particular subgenre. So for me, that's where the most interesting horror has always sort of lied, and really it's the subgenre that's pushed the broader genre forward as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. It can be the scariest subgenre as well, can't it? I think the kind of psychological stuff, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, the stuff that really gets under your skin and sort of makes you think, oh God, I'm messed up. It's all about me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it makes anything that makes you look inward is more terrifying than, a monster.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about the genre that we're covering this series, which is the kind of alien stuff, sci-fi horror and that kind of thing. What are your thoughts on this area of the genre? Are you a fan?
I am a fan. I think that, it is a genre, again, that is quite broad, because really an alien can be whatever you want it to be,
yeah,
right? Like it can be a terrifying monster, it can be a little green man, it can be something totally nebulous and original and terrifying and aimless. And I think in the case of the original Alien, like what was so scary about the xenomorph was that it sort of was just, it was aimless. It just wanted to kill.
Yes.
There was no backstory. And of course, Ridley Scott decided that they must have a backstory, which is why I didn't really like the sequels a lot. But, I think that the alien genre allows for a lot of creativity and, of course, a lot of like changing what the boogeyman is. Mm-hmm. And so, every single alien film is a very pure product of the filmmaker's imagination, because they're just like, okay, well, this particular alien is going to go into people's bodies and copy them and become a clone.
Yes.
And then overtake the earth. And it's like, why? Who knows? They just want to do that.
Yeah.
And it's like, and I suppose it's the same with the movie that we're sort of talking about. It's just that the alien's goal is just to eat humans.
Yeah.
That's it. It's as simple as that. But of course it's, it's just whatever the filmmaker wants it to be. And I love that.
Yeah, me too. I love that as well. It's been a real joy, I think, this series is just how broad and varied it can be, because these aliens can literally look like anything. They can do anything. And that's been really fun, I think, to kind of explore.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, speaking of, let's get into the movie we're going to talk about this week. What a fun movie this is. This is Bad Taste, Peter Jackson's Bad Taste from 1987.
Oh, we've got trouble.
Good word.
Right, we're on our way.
Tomorrow we're having you for lunch.
What are we going to do if we're spotted, Frank? Go, Frank!
It's a very simple story, I think, if we drill it down. It's the story of these aliens who have sort of invaded Earth, specifically a fictional town in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And their goal is to sort of eat human flesh, because that's the new taste.
Yep.
That's the current fast food sensation for this particular species of alien. And in this fictional town in New Zealand, there's a sort of a crack team of young men who have been employed by the government in some kind of nebulous way to, stop the aliens. And one of these young men is called Derek, and a lot of the film focuses on his exploits. And really, it's just the battle between human and alien. It's fairly simple.
It is,
as far as plots go.
It is very simple, isn't it? It kind of like drops you in it, sort of explains what's going on, and then it's like off you go, basically, isn't it?
Exactly.
Humans versus aliens. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your own history with this film, Lucy. Do you remember kind of how you first discovered it, and what do you think of the movie now?
Well, I mean, we were sort of. Peter Jackson's early splatter movies were very front and center growing up. I was born in the 80s, and this film was made in 1987. So, it it was in our local video stores in the horror section. I remember the cover of the VHS. You always remember the cover of the VHS. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And is this the one that had like the alien kind of giving the finger?
Doing the flipping the bird. Yeah.
So good.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, you know, at a young age, I found that really titillating and desperately wanted to see it for that reason. I think when I'm sort of thinking back to when I first saw it, I remember renting it. I think I saw it later. I saw Braindead incidentally, you know, his third splatter film. I saw that incidentally on television, but I remember renting with some friends of mine when I was 15, renting Bad Taste and sitting down and watching it.
Yeah.
And just being so grossed out, like really grossed out. And, you know, I was one of those teenagers that was like, oh, I watch everything. Because as I mentioned, my dad, you know, was very giving with his knowledge of the genre. And so I sort of thought that I was really hardened. Yeah. But I was still... Peter Jackson's got a certain, like, splatter sort of technique, which I just find so gross.
100%.
And I don't know. And I think it might also have something to do with the fact that I am from New Zealand. And all of this... And it was filmed in Wellington, which is where I grew up.
Oh.
And there's something really disturbing about the familiar of the New Zealand landscape with this really disgusting, like, blood and gore. You know what I mean?
100%.
It just like it made me feel more uncomfortable because it was filmed in New Zealand. I think it sort of affected me more because I was like, ooh, this is just next door. You know, in Braindead, in the scene in Braindead where the little baby's in that playground.
Yeah.
I used to play in that playground as a kid.
That's awesome. That's so cool. I could imagine that must be a bit disturbing, you know? And it is just a little bit. There is something so weird and sort of charming about it, about the way that it is this kind of very, I don't know, quaint backdrop in a way with this really extreme splattery stuff happening against that backdrop.
Yeah.
You know, I guess.
And it's so bizarre because you look at interviews of Peter Jackson at that age. I think he was 25 when he made Bad Taste. And he's just so softly spoken and he's just such a gentle Kiwi lad. Yeah. And it's just so amusing that he was the one that made this. You know what I mean? Of all people. Just this very sweet kind of unassuming nerd was the one who made this disgusting alien horror flesh movie.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree with you, and that's so often the way, isn't it, with horror filmmakers? But yeah, it is. There is something. Maybe I should start off by asking you about the New Zealand aspect of it. I feel like New Zealand horror has a kind of vibe. I feel like, and you know, you kind of get a similar kind of vibe or tone with a lot of New Zealand horror. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you think you would describe your typical kind of Kiwi horror?
Well, I mean, I think that Sam Neill starred in this documentary that I saw many years ago, which I think kind of nailed it. It was called The Cinema of the Unease. Right. And it's essentially how New Zealand horror uses the very well, it's beautiful, gorgeous landscape. New Zealand is a beautiful, beautiful country, and it's very dramatic. Yeah. But it's also, in that drama, there's a kind of like unknowableness. Yeah. And I think that a lot of New Zealand horror has typically, you know, very much thrived on using that backdrop as something to make you feel dwarfed and daunted and unnerved by. And Australian horror does the same thing actually, because they, you know, there's a different backdrop in Australia, but it's just as sort of unknowable. Yes. And so I think typically New Zealand horror has kind of utilized that, and I think actually Peter Jackson did a good job with Heavenly Creatures more than any of his earlier stuff at that kind of unnerving landscape, especially, you know, in that final bushwalk scene. But look, I'm getting like totally carried away with a different movie. But you know, in the case of Bad Taste, it is quite dramatic, I suppose. But like for me, that's just Wellington. You know, like the hills and everything. That's just like, that's not really like super unnerving or uncanny. It's just a film made in Wellington. You know what I mean? Yeah. And there is this kind of, I think, I don't know, you know, in comparison to Australian horror,
which tends to be sort of darker and more nihilistic. There's a kind of playful tone in a lot of the New Zealand horror that I've seen as well, right? There is something, no matter how dark or gross it gets, there is also a kind of playfulness. And maybe that is just also Peter Jackson's influence on filmmakers since, I don't know. But it does feel like that has kind of been the trend, I think, you know?
I think definitely Bad Taste was a moment.
Yes.
And I think ever since then, you know, we have seen that more playful vibe come into our horror movies. I mean, I think there was something really metaphorical about the scene in Bad Taste where that stray rocket blows up the sheep. Yes. I think that there's something kind of a bit like metaphorical there. You know what I mean? It's just like, okay, I'm coming to disrupt everything. And I think that, you know, you have seen that in a lot of Kiwi horror since. But also we have to make a joke as a people, you know, as we New Zealanders have to make a joke. If we don't make a joke, then people will take us too seriously, and we can't have that.
Yeah, I love it. So what do you think? How do you think this movie holds up, you know, giving it a watch in 2021? Obviously this was, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as we go, but an incredibly low budget movie, right? Made by
so low budget.
Peter Jackson, you know, like you say, age 25. I think it took him several years to actually finish it, didn't he? Him and his mates, essentially, you know, making and starring in this weird little film in Wellington. But how do you find it, and what do you think of just how the film holds up and how it looks now?
I mean, I see it as an amazing testing ground for what's to come.
Yeah.
You know, I think Bad Taste is the sort of precursor to Brain Dead, which I think is a masterpiece. I think Brain Dead is one of the best films ever made.
Agreed.
It's like, you know, it's just, I think it's Peter Jackson. I hate, this is a cliche, but it's like him just running on all cylinders. You know what I mean? It's like the ultimate in splatter creativity. And I think you're seeing him just figure that out in Bad Taste and start, you know, experimenting. I mean, it was made sort of every weekend across 4 years, because Peter Jackson at the time had a full-time job at a newspaper, and so, you know, he and his mates were just making this on the weekend, and then the New Zealand Film Commission came in at the very end and like injected the cash that they needed to finish it. But I can imagine that it would have just gone on and on and on and on, you know, forever if they hadn't done that. Yes. And it kind of does feel a little bit like that. You know, it's a bit meandering, I think. Now many years later, you know, the big shootout sort of bulk of it just goes on a bit long, and it feels a bit like boys playing in a treehouse with a sort of meandering storyline that never really goes anywhere. I think there are some absolutely brilliant moments in Bad Taste, like really clever sort of moments that have definitely stuck with me. But as a whole, I think if I was an editor, I would have trimmed a good deal out of the middle part, especially of that film.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I love it as well. And I rewatched it again this week, and I still think it's so fun and so fantastic. But I do think there are moments of it, like you said, that drag it. And there's so little actually in terms of plot, right, that it does in a way feel a bit like a short film that's been stretched into like 90 minutes, right? Yeah,
and you can feel that they made it over 4 years worth of weekends. Like that is, you can feel that is the movie. It's just a bit disjointed and all over the place, and you know, the haircuts change because you know, they filmed it over such a long period of time. But one thing that I do think still holds up, and I still, you know, I rewatched it recently, and I would say that the gore still makes me feel queasy. You know, and this is 1987, and that homemade like DIY gore still makes me feel like really sick. Yes. You know, and it's the same. I feel the same way with Brain Dead. I mean, Brain Dead's a whole other kettle of fish, but like the gore and the effects are still pretty marvelous, I would say, today.
Oh my God. I mean, the gore, and we'll come to this, but there is a moment in this film that made me almost gag in the way that a certain moment in Brain Dead did as well, you know, and it's like Peter Jackson is the master at that, isn't he?
He is. It's this horrible sort of, he delights in, and the thing is with Bad Taste is that it's not just the gore that's gross. It's sort of all of it. Every part of it is a bit gross.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
It's like grimy and yeah.
And his performance, because of course he plays Derek, who I mentioned before, and his performance as Derek is just gross. Like, even before any blood has been spilled, Derek is disgusting. I don't want to look at his face.
I know.
Like, he's just so gross. You know, and it's just, there is something that sort of permeates the whole film that it's just like, ugh, you know, like that.
You're so right. There is, and actually, I love that Peter Jackson didn't give a fuck about making himself look as unattractive as possible, particularly as Derek, right? Like, the camera shoved right in his face where his kind of like mouth and teeth are like right there throughout the whole film as well. And really funny, really gross. Yeah, you're right. There is a kind of grossness. Yeah.
Gross. And, you know, he loves these big close-ups, Peter Jackson. And in this movie in particular, as you say, the close-ups are just... Ugh, I didn't want to see all of that. I don't want to see the spit inside your mouth. And I can see it. And that's disgusting.
It's so good, isn't it? And I was going to ask you, like, this is a really difficult thing, I think, with Peter Jackson of all directors. Like, how you kind of describe a Peter Jackson film, because his early stuff is so different to what he did. You know, because there's something so visceral. Particularly when you look at his old films, I would say he's very much a visceral filmmaker, isn't he? Like, everything is really up close and, like, there's, like, real bodily functions and it's really kind of literally in your face kind of stuff. But then there's something so sort of mannered about Lord of the Rings and that kind of thing as well, right? It's amazing that it's the same guy in a way.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, there are moments in Lord of the Rings where you can see those early influences, that early filmmaker shine through. Very, you know, they're there. There are parts of Lord of the Rings that are quite gross, you know, that are quite like frightening.
Yes.
But for me, I've always preferred Peter Jackson as during his early career. Like, I like Lord of the Rings, and my friends are Lord of the Rings mad. But for me, I've always preferred him as a weird, unnerving DIY horror filmmaker. And of course, I think Heavenly Creatures is one of the greatest movies ever made. Incredible. So it's like, you know, I think that his earlier body of work is the period that I'm obsessed with personally. Yeah,
absolutely. And like you say, you know, Lord of the Rings has so many fans. It's one of the kind of, it's like the one that we all agree is like the best book adaptation in a way, isn't it? Where it's like fans of the books love it, non-fans of the books love it. It's like this perfect little thing that he managed to do. And he's just, clearly no matter what genre he does, he's just a really good storyteller, I think, isn't he?
He is. And he's like, I think the thing about Peter Jackson is that he's such a, and I hate people who describe themselves as this, but I'm allowed to describe him as this. He's such a film nerd, you know what I mean? Like, he's obsessed with the medium, and he was always obsessed with the medium. And you know, I sort of think people sort of say, how did he get from this to Lord of the Rings? And I think that he was always up for a challenge. I think that you can say of Peter Jackson. You know, he's like, how am I going to make this? And he does it so well, but I think he's also obsessed with the medium to a fault in some instances. You know, the Hobbit sort of series and how he wanted to film that series, you know, was just like, okay, well, that was an interesting experiment, but I don't think it was necessary. And probably a ton of money was poured into, you know, that kind of an experiment. And you know, I think I love that he is always sort of pushing and prodding at the edges of how to of filmmaking and what he can do. But you know, I much preferred that when he had less money.
I know, I totally agree with you. He's one of those filmmakers, isn't he? A bit like James Cameron, a bit like Ang Lee, where they've kind of almost become too obsessed now with what, you know, new ways of making films, when actually you just think, oh, these guys are just so good at just telling stories. Just go back and do what you do so well, you know? It's
absolutely.
Yeah,
it is. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who would love to see him return to horror. I think, you know, one of the frustrating things about being a fan of horror is that a lot of filmmakers sort of cut their teeth on that genre and then sort of move on to other things. And it's like, okay, that's great because it's a very accessible genre. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I would love to see filmmakers who began in horror and then have gone on to, you know, win Oscars and stuff, come back to it And
right.
like with all of their knowledge and their experience and, you know, with funding behind them this time, it would be wonderful to see what they could do. But, you know, of course, very few of them sort of want to return, which I think is a shame because I think horror is the best genre and I want to see everyone play around in it.
I know. That's what I love at the moment about filmmakers like Jordan Peele and Mike Flanagan, because they feel like they're so firmly like as successful as they're getting. They just want to be horror or genre filmmakers almost, you know, and that's so exciting. Yeah.
And they shout it loud and proud, you know, they say, yes, this is not, you know, I've interviewed, in my career, I've interviewed M. Night Shyamalan and I've interviewed Ridley Scott. And I remember both of them sort of during these interviews, not wanting to mention the word horror and sort of almost finding it repulsive when it was brought up. And it's like, you're allowed to say that your film is a horror movie. You know, it doesn't have to be a family thriller. It can be a horror. You're allowed to say it, you know, like...
It's so true. It's so true. I think we all pray that one day Peter Jackson might return to a bit of horror, right? Because he was so good at it.
so good at it.
What do you think of him acting in this film? Like you say, he plays two roles in this. It's Derek and who's the other guy who plays Robert, I think?
Robert.
Who's the alien, right? Again, which I think is quite funny because like you say, this film took so long to film that there are, you know, he's got a beard as one character and he's clean shaven as the other, right? And he kind of uses that to his advantage of when he plays two characters fighting each other and everything, which is absolutely hilarious, right?
This is such a DIY movie. And, you know, he baked all the alien masks in his mum's oven. You know, that's how DIY we're sort of talking. And, you know, none of the acting is particularly memorable, but I will say that Peter Jackson as Robert and Derek, you know, he's certainly giving it like the old college try. You know what I mean? He's giving it a good shot. And he's definitely the most memorable performer in the film. You know, and I am particularly impressed with his performance as Derek because, as you say, he's just gross and he's just so unafraid to be completely gross.
Yeah.
Derek's a horrible little character. I would never want to meet him in real life, you know.
So good. I love it. And yeah, you're right. I mean, the story, like you said, sets up as like Derek being part of this little crew of men who kill or capture aliens or something.
It's very vague.
It doesn't really matter, does it? Yeah, you're kind of in it to watch the grossness. And let me ask you a bit about, I mean, we touched on this already, but the gore and the practical effects. I mean, I think we're about 10 minutes into the film when we get that amazing head being kind of ripped open, spewing kind of liquids, you know, moment.
Yeah.
This is a great movie for body horror, isn't it?
It really is. And it's like, I think the other thing that I love so much about Peter Jackson's sort of approach to gore is that he does things, you know how like if you tried to remove a man's head, like it probably wouldn't rip clean off and have like a flapping bit of spine attached to it that would sort of go like flap around like a fish tail. Yeah. But that's what you sort of think, that's what you think would happen. Like, yes. like, do you know what I mean? He's like, this is probably what like, it's almost like the sort of childlike approach to it. It's
like cartoony, isn't it?
It's cartoon, exactly. It's very cartoony. It's like, okay, well, this is what I think would happen.
Yeah,
is it would flap around like a gross fishtail, and I love that approach to gore. It's like it's as disgusting as you could sort of imagine it to be, and as extreme as you can imagine it to be. And you know, and this is a movie where a man can go through an alien body and be birthed out the other side.
Oh, like, I love that.
And you sort of think that's probably, you know, in a cartoony world, that is exactly what would happen. That is exactly how it would work.
Yeah.
And I love that approach to gore. It's delightful and disgusting.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is exactly what it is. It's cartoony. It's like animated. It's like you're watching a live action, almost Looney Tunes cartoon or something like that, right? In terms of the violence being so extreme but so hilarious. And yeah, like there's a difference, isn't there? Like you said, like you were able to watch Evil Dead apart from the tree scene. You could watch the rest of the Evil Dead when you're a kid in the same way that you could watch a lot of Peter Jackson movies when you're a kid as well, because it's not gore in the way that like I don't know, like a Last House on the Left gore, or like even David Cronenberg, which has something a little bit more adult and kind of, you know, frightening about it and real about it. Whereas there's something just so extreme and silly about the grossness in this, right?
It's so silly, and like, you know, everything looks, it's like everything's pink. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like it is like the blood is pink. Like it sort of merges together with like pus to kind of make a kind of gross pink ooze that we apparently have in our bodies. It's all extremely exaggerated, but you know, one of the things that I also find so repulsive, and this is in both Meet the Feebles and Brain Dead as well, is the sound effects. The sound effects that come along with the gore. Like he's so good at zoning in on the sound of like spit rolling around in someone's mouth, or like the sound of, you know, insides coming out. Like it's sort of a horrible sort of farting, squelching noise that I'm like grossing myself out just talking about it. But like that's what, you know, that's a big part of why it's so disgusting, is like, and it's very loud, especially in Bad Taste. Like the sound mix is very extreme. And it, you know, it's a big part of why we sort of just feel really dirty afterwards. It's like, you feel a bit like,
it's the classic kind of abject bodily function kind of vibe, isn't it? And it's so wet and squelchy. The moment for me that kills me, and it's the same as in Brain Dead, obviously the famous moment in Brain Dead where the I know what you're talking about.
Custard. Can I guess?
Yeah,
the custard.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's the custard. That's the scene where I still can't watch that without feeling nauseous.
Yes,
and I've seen it so many times.
The custard is unbearable. So and there's something similar for me in Bad Taste where they all hold Robert, I think it's Robert, and you know, he like vomits like green stuff into that bowl, and then the old guy eats it, and it's and he's like, oh, that bit had a little lump in it and stuff.
It's like, oh, I got a chunky bit. And he talks about the vomit as having like this beautiful bouquet. And I mean, like, the vomit is so, and you know, we're talking cartoon, it's so not what vomit could ever look like unless you've eaten something really weird. But like, you know, it doesn't look real yet. As soon as they start eating it, it's just so gross. You know, and the fact that the guy, and again, I forget all their names because they're so, the lead actors are just so generic. But the fact that he likes it and then goes back for more, it's just,
it's so disgusting. And again, it's kind of juvenile in how gross it is, isn't it? But it's just, and you were so right when you described it as like, basically a bunch of boys playing on the weekend is what we're seeing, is what this film is, right? But it's really well done though at the same time.
Yeah, and they kind of make out the story as they go.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, especially with that shootout. But yeah, no, the vomit scene is definitely the one I remember the most. Like I'm someone who really doesn't like puke in movies as well.
Same.
Like that's the one thing that I'll have to look away. And the only reason I sort of managed to watch that is just because the vomit is just so ridiculously fake.
Yeah, it's like Exorcist vomit, right? It's like doesn't really look like, but you're right. Like exactly the same with me. I can handle any amount of gore. I can handle the heads being ripped off, but people as eating soon as there's vomit, lumpy puke. I'm sorry, that is.
And it's steaming. Do you remember it's steaming? It's even worse. Is that horrible steam coming off it? Like he's like, this did just come from someone's body. It's steaming.
It is disgusting. So these aliens, I mean, like, I've been asking everyone each week, what kind of aliens have we got here? What makes these aliens unique or stand out or particularly frightening or gross or whatever compared to other aliens we've looked at? I mean, what do you think of the aliens that Peter Jackson has created here in Bad Taste?
I think they're hilarious. I think they're hilarious for two reasons. One, because of the way that they look. I mean, the fact that they're sort of these weird bulbous potato heads, and like their butts. You know, when they transform and their butts stick out of their, like they rip the trousers, so they got these little butts running around.
Yeah.
But the sort of the reason that they're so hilarious, apart from the way that they look, is that they're sort of really snobby. Like
Yes.
the Lord Crumb character, who's the sort of the leader of the aliens, like he's a real snob. You know, he's like, we can't wait to get off this shitty planet. And it's like,
Yeah.
where did this snobbery come from? Like, what's wrong with Earth? Like, what's your deal? But he's like, you know, he's so sort of, it's distasteful to him, and like human beings are distasteful, and the fact that they have to dress up as human beings is distasteful. And I think
Yes.
that's so funny because they're so ridiculous to look at, yet they're really judgmental of like human beings.
It's so true.
It's just so stupid.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a sort of... It's like a fine dining thing with these aliens, right? Isn't it? The fact that they're here to eat us, and like the fact that they, you know, pop us in a boiling pot with like veg, like a sort of soup, right, as well. And yeah, they've got that
really
kind of snobbery.
delicately.
Yeah, it's almost like they treat eating humans as like some sort of like having foie gras or something, right? It's like that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, they're absolutely like absurd and not at all frightening. I mean, they're just, as we say, this, you know, the more we sort of talk about it, the more this movie is just a cartoon. It's just, they're just these ridiculous looking things with no personality to speak of other than this kind of unexplained snobbery.
Yeah.
It's sort of...
Yeah, because they've got... So you've got like the head kind of alien, right? Who's name is Lord Crumb, I believe.
Lord
right?
Crumb.
Lord Crumb.
Except in the credits, he's just labelled lead alien. He's not. He doesn't even have a name.
So I'm not really sure where Lord Crumb comes from in the cast list, but he's there. And the other aliens are all sort of like minions almost. So like the character of Robert is this kind of like brain dead, no pun intended, servant or minion or something, right? It's quite strange. They're not all the same in a way. Like they don't seem the same. Yeah.
No, there's nothing really going on upstairs. They seem to just be motivated by food, and that's pretty much it. And you know, there's a lot of inconsistency with these aliens as well. You know, half of them you can pull off their head, cut them in half, and they'll still be alive. But then the other half, like they get a single bullet shot, like, you know, a single bullet to the guts, and they're dead. Like there's no real consistency to how to kill these guys either.
It's so true. It's so true. I mean, there's almost not much more to talk about really when it comes to like the story of this film. I mean, that's sort of it. Is there anything in particular else, like any highlights for you, any standout moments that we haven't already touched upon that you want to mention?
I mean, not really. There's a lot of, you know, as I said when we sort of talk about this being a testing ground, you know, there's a lot of like early influence that you see in Peter Jackson's films subsequently, and you know, a lot of his passions shining through. You know, the Morris Minor, which appears in a lot of his subsequent movies. His obsession with the Beatles obviously pops up in this film.
Yes.
And you know, this kind of DIY spirit that really carries through the film. And you know, I don't know how much you know about New Zealand, Mike, but as a people, New Zealanders are typically very proud of the Kiwi DIY spirit. You know, if you've got a sort of two hands and a working brain, I don't know where I'm going with this, but you know, you can do anything, sort of thing. But you know, as a people, we're very sort of proud of that, and I can see why Peter Jackson was, you know, quite lauded, because he really did make this film out of just basically nothing. You know, all of the film equipment was made by him, aside from the camera. You know, all of the dollies and stuff like that was just built with bits of wood. All the props were made by hand. It was all just very, it was just DIY, and it's a very New Zealand film for that reason. You know, it's I don't know whether we should be, it's kind of an old-fashioned sentiment, but I like this film. I think it's a sort of a wonderful piece of history. You know, and I think you watch it for that reason. I don't think I'd sit anyone down and say, this is an amazing horror film, you've got to watch it. It's more like, this is an amazing piece of history. This is where Peter Jackson sort of showed the world what he wanted to do and what he was capable of. And I love it for that reason, almost as like a curiosity rather than a a wonderful piece of filmmaking.
Totally. It's like this beautiful kind of weird historical artifact in a way, isn't it?
It is.
You know, it's like finding somebody's home movies when they made it, that they made as a child, which I guess it kind of is that in a way, but it is like, I think because of the fact that Peter Jackson is now, what is he, one of the 5, I think I read, biggest grossing filmmakers ever, billions, obviously. And it's just amazing to watch this weird, grimy little movie that he made, with so much charm still. That's the thing. I mean, despite all of its limitations, it's clearly made by somebody who knows what they're doing, right? Who just understands the language of film, how to tell a story, how to make something so visually interesting and tonally interesting as well. It's all there in this weird little movie. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it is a sort of a wonderful appetizer for the main course, which is Brain Dead. I mean, I like Meet the Feebles, but it's sort of, it doesn't really add much to the Peter Jackson story, whereas I think Brain Dead really was the kind of everything that he'd learned about splatter filmmaking coming together in this glorious bloodbath, and one of the most creative films horror films I've ever watched. But you can see just the seeds of that in Bad Taste, and especially I mentioned it earlier, but especially that part where Derek goes right through the alien and then comes out and he says, "I'm born again," and of course that something really similar happens in Brain Dead, but to a much more extreme degree. Yes, you know what I'm talking about. I do. Yes,
and it really was just him having a lot of fun with his mates, but also just giving us that little taste of what was to come.
Yeah, what he can do. You're so right. It's a really similar, I guess, in a way, when I think about it now, career trajectory to Sam Raimi, isn't it? That idea of like, he made Evil Dead with his mates for no money. Then he made Evil Dead 2, which was a kind of the same film again, but better with more money in a way. And it's sort of similar to Bad Taste, Brain Dead in a way. And then like, Sam Raimi, who became this superhero director, Peter Jackson became this kind of blockbuster director, and it's that similar kind of thing. But yeah, I think it is. It's like this kind of beautiful little appetizer for then what he was about to do with a bit of funding, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And with the sort of New Zealand Film Commission believing in him and people sort of believing in him this time, and sort of helping him along the way, it's just amazing to look at what he did with very, very little help, aside from the help of his mates.
It's so cool. I do just want to shout again to the scene near the beginning where he is having a fight with himself on the cliff. One of himself clean shaven, the other bearded. Shot and edited this months, if not years apart, right? And I think that is so clever and so fun. And that is kind of, that scene in a way feels like the sort of essence of this film in a way.
Yeah, and the essence of Peter Jackson. I mean, he is very dedicated. That you can say for Peter Jackson. He's a very dedicated filmmaker. If he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it.
Yeah, that's it. He put the time in. So there you go. Well, there you are. And what I was going to ask you was, going forward, what was your favourite Peter Jackson movie? And I'm guessing by the sounds of it, it's Brain Dead, is it?
I mean, I would say it's a tie between Brain Dead and Heavenly Creatures, but I will say that I think Brain Dead has like, I've aged alongside Brain Dead. I saw Heavenly Creatures when I was very young, and like I was a teenager, and I was sort of impressionable, and coming to sort of grips with my sexuality, and like Heavenly Creatures was a very like perfect movie for me at that time. Yeah. But as I've gotten older, I've grown to appreciate just the ballet that is Brain Dead. Yes. It is just the most exquisitely put together splatter film. And that is, when I sort of think what is the pinnacle of splatter to me, it's Brain Dead. And I think, as I said, it's one of the best films of all time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Bad Taste, Brain Dead, great double bill, right? What a double bill.
Absolutely. Killer double bill. Just don't eat them, just don't eat while you're watching them,
No, absolutely. Well, there you go. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for this. This has been so much fun to discuss this movie. And let me just finish off by asking you, as I ask all my new guests, what's your favourite horror film?
Oh my God. I knew you were going to ask me this, but I sort of forgot.
Yeah. It's such a cruel question, I know.
It is a cruel question. I would say that, a lot of your guests have answered this, and so I won't dwell on it, but I would say The Exorcist in terms of how much time I've obsessed over it in my life. And, that for me is the movie that I will continually come back to time and time again. And yeah, I think it's brilliant. That's the thing. I can't talk about it anymore. Like everything that's needed to be said about The Exorcist has been said. But yeah, that would be mine.
Is it also the movie that kind of scared you the most, would you say? Or is that a different film?
It was the movie that my dad said that I couldn't watch. And so it immediately became a legend in my psyche. Mm-hmm. And then I stayed up one night and watched it, and I was too young. And I would sort of describe it as stepping into shoes that were too big for me. Right.
Yes.
Like I had watched Evil Dead, and I had watched a bunch of, more as we discussed, like more cartoony horror films. And then I watched The Exorcist, and it was like, oh, this is too big for me. This is too big for my brain hasn't formed enough to grapple with this.
Absolutely. There is horror you can watch when you're a kid, right? And then there's horror for grown-ups. And, like, there are some movies when you're like, oh, shit, this is not for me yet in this stage in my life. Yeah, it's so true. It's so true.
My malformed brain,
I know. It still holds up. So there you go. Well, excellent choice. Well, Lucy, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Mike.
I hope you'll come back and join me again on the podcast at some point in the future. But until then, just let us know where people can find you out there on the internet and where they can find more of your stuff.
Absolutely. Well, I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Luce O'Brien, and IGN.com is where I work. So please check it out.
Amazing.
I make all the features, so I'll be behind something that you've enjoyed, hopefully.
Love it. Lucy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mike.
You want your mask? Come and get it! I'm coming for you, Michael.
Hello, everybody. That was a little clip you just heard there, of course, from Halloween Kills, the new David Gordon Green Halloween sequel. This is technically what would you call it? It's sort of the second movie in the new generation of Halloween films, although it's sort of the third movie if you count the fact that it's taking place after Halloween from 1978 and then Halloween from 2018. But also it's sort of the 12th movie because there have actually been that many Halloween films before this. It's very confusing. Very, very, very confusing. But anyway, this week over on Patreon, we are going to be discussing all things Halloween Kills. So that should make for a very interesting discussion. It's one of the many, many new releases and new horror films that we are covering right here on Patreon across October. We've also got an episode about Malignant, an episode about Midnight Mass, and we've got loads of other stuff to cover in the upcoming few weeks. As right now, I'm at London Film Festival with Brad Hanson and Louise Blaine, and we'll be watching a whole bunch of stuff, including the new Edgar Wright movie, the new Rob Savage movie, and a whole bunch of other really interesting new horror and genre properties. So if you want to get involved and listen to all of these bonus episodes, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolution of horror. If you sign up at a $5 per month level, you will get to hear a lot of these bonus reviews and interviews and other special bonus episodes. But you can also sign up at a $10 level, which will get you a new bonus episode every single week, including access to all of our exclusive mini-seasons. You can also go one higher than that and sign up at a $20 per month level, which will also make you an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, and you'll get your own little dedicated segment on an episode right here on the main feed. indeed. So, patreon.com/evolution of horror. Everybody who signs up from the UK will get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker, and everybody who signs up, no matter where you're from or what tier it is, will get a very special shout out on the podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up to our Patreon in the last couple of weeks a very special thanks. So a big thank you to Green Alex, Jill, Kimmy Norton, Mads KB, Jose Conseco, Alex Hurl, Kev Walsh, Joe, Keith Calder, Dan Barber, Vidrana Budimir, Jared Elliott, Rosanna Ortega Napoli, Faye Collier, Megan Boyd, Lanky Did It, Joseph Pakigo, Andrew Owen, Andrew Munoz, Liam Nolan, Grayson Taylor, Alec Chillingworth, Selma Evenstead, Erica Hinman, Izzy Bergwin, Kiki, Rachel Richmond, Veronica Brundle, Laura Collins, Carl Edwards, Kathleen Keogh, Daryl Nilbert, Isaiah Howard, Chris Nelson, Jennifer Gamil, Jen Pihowick, Miriam Dornauer, Lara Wilbur, Andrew Flynn, Robert McGinley Myers, Patches O'Hallahan, Chris, Martha Hegarty, Daedria Eccles, and Alex West, friend of the pod, Alex West. A huge thank you to Alex and all of those awesome people who signed onto our Patreon this last couple of weeks. And one more time, if you want to join all of these lovely, generous people and get treated to regular bonus episodes, including our Halloween Kills episode next week, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, in the second half of this week's episode, it's time to discuss all things Killer Klowns from Outer Space. Joining me to discuss all things Killer Klowns, somebody who has lived with a lot of trauma since watching this film as a child. She's a film producer, filmmaker, a whole bunch of other stuff. She was last here just a few weeks ago discussing Ridley Scott's Alien with me, and she's back. Hello, Jen Handorf.
Hello again, Mike Munzer.
Hello. Thank you so much for being back here. How are you?
I'm doing really well, actually. Busy as always, but enjoying myself, and I'm immersed in the world of film festivals at the moment, which is one of my favorite places to be.
I know, right? It is like, I was just saying to someone earlier, I was like, this is such an exciting time / crazy busy time, isn't it? It's like not only film festivals, but also October as a horror fan and as a horror podcaster. It's incredibly busy. I can't believe the list of amazing new stuff coming out over the next few weeks as well. But also there's that little bit of me that's like, couldn't they have spaced some of this out sort of across the year, you know? But it's very exciting.
It's really bonkers, and obviously there's fallout from the pandemic that shall not be named.
Yes.
That because all the release dates and everything are stacked on top of each other, and nobody's been out of the house for ages. So it is all a bit mad. I feel like I'm gonna just commit to 31 days of Halloween this year, just to really suck the marrow out of the candy corn, as it were.
I love it. Do you have like a staple Halloween viewing? I mean, is it something like Halloween, for example, or is there any kind of classic that you like to revisit every October?
So it depends really, because I tend to be doing a lot. So
yes.
it's I don't tend to just sit at home and watch something, and I'm I have a slightly tragic answer. It's not even that tragic. It's fine. It's the last time I actually stayed home and watched a movie for Halloween, it was just Beetlejuice, because I turned it on while the kids were ringing the door, because kids ring the doorbell in my neighborhood, which I love.
That's great.
I think it's because we insisted on giving candy when we moved in 14 years ago, and the rumors have spread, so now everybody on our street has to give candy.
That lady gives candy. Oh my God.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. And, so yeah, because Dan and I, as you can imagine, we tend to do it up on Halloween, and we usually have like some kind of house party or some kind of like, we'll throw an event somewhere, because it is our Christmas. So but yeah, and then as far as viewings go, like I think my favorite Halloween viewing looking back was probably when they did that screening of The Beyond, with Fabio Frizzi doing the score with it.
Oh my God.
That was really, really good. Cause and Dan dressed up as the zombie that gets eaten by a shark from Zombie 3. And I was what's her name from The Beyond with some blind effect contacts, which I will never wear again. Can I just Halloween warning to everyone out there? Do not wear those contacts. They're so bad for your eyes, and you only get one set of eyes. So just do not wear those things. They're terribly unsafe.
Yeah, very, very good. Good advice. Sound advice. So, I mean, you were here a few weeks ago talking about Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien. And, you know, we're talking about something equally as profound, as deep, as influential, as important, right? But it really made me laugh because, like, I kind of had in mind for you, Jen. I was like, yeah, I'll get Jen in to come and talk about Alien. But you actually said to me, you were like, have you got anyone yet to cover Killer Klowns from Outer Space? So this is clearly a movie close to your heart by the sounds of it.
It is. It's close to my nightmares is what it is. So I don't know how old we were, and my brother swears it wasn't as young as 6 years old, but I think I was as young as 6 years old. My older brother showed me this film at some point, and in my memory, he was tasked with babysitting me and then chose to put this on, and I obviously was riveted for the entire night, which made his job easy because I was just stuck to the screen. But yeah, and ever since then, I've had a terrible fear of clowns, and I genuinely do. I do not like clowns. They make me deeply uncomfortable. Drag queens are fine. It's not just about like face makeup or anything like that. It's not something that's like sideways triggered. Very specifically clowns. Strangely, it has never bothered me, and I think because it's such an archetype.
That's really interesting, yeah.
But I think it's sort of its own thing, really.
Yeah, there are, and we'll get into this as we go, but there are different types of clowns, different types of clown makeup, different types of clowns you see in cinema, and these ones are very specific, but we'll get into that.
Man.
It's I can't wait, so let's begin.
I'm really genuinely uncomfortable even talking about it. Like, I'm sat here, I'm just like, oh, okay, yeah, because like I just keep thinking about them. I just keep picturing them in my mind, and it's increasingly
Jen,
you're gonna watch me squirm in my chair this whole conversation.
I want you to think of this recording as like therapy, right? Just talk me through it. Talk me through how you're feeling.
Right. Okay.
Let's do this then, Jen. Killer Klowns from Outer Space from 1988. First of all, Jen, give us a little brief plot synopsis of what happens in Killer Klowns.
The plot is so irrelevant to the actual film. It's brilliant. So, you know, the plot of this film is straight out of, like, classic B-movie alien invasion. You know, small town, aliens land, start killing people or you know, cotton candy bubbling people. And there's the teenagers who are trying to tell the police that it's happening, but unfortunately the police won't believe them. It's all capped off by a giant killer clown.
Oh,
which is deeply unsettling for me. Because it's sort of like a puppet. It's sort of like a marionette mixed with a giant evil latex-faced clown. So just, yeah, very clearly upsetting. And then everything's fine after that. Yeah, everything's fine. So it's not a film that the plot is what actually makes it in any way, shape, or form. It's very much a visual delight, this film.
It is, isn't it? What a visual feast. I think I first saw it when I was a teenager and rented it from some Blockbuster video store or something, and had so much fun with it. I remember finding it so fun. Funnily enough, it didn't get me in that kind of way, and I remember thinking it was going to scare me, but it didn't, because it was so kind of fun and almost cartoonish. But I can imagine that if you watch this film too young, it would absolutely traumatize you, as it has done you. Yeah. It sounds a bit.
I mean, yeah, that's the thing, and it's really just a series of vignettes. This film, it's a series of vignettes for how the creepy alien clowns kill people, and you could imagine it like nowadays as a sort of like montage of horror directors, an anthology of some kind. But yeah, it really is just one horrible murder after another, and they kill a dog right at the front. They're not holding back in this film at all. It's definitely a film that was made, and because it was made by, we'll talk about them, I'm sure, but the Chiodo brothers, who themselves were puppeteers and special effects artists. I'm very much reminded by the way that Dan approaches filmmaking, which is to say it would be really cool if we did this. And then putting a scene in where you do that thing. So, you can imagine them saying, it'd be really cool if we shot a popcorn gun at people, and then those tiny popcorns were like little clown seeds, and then they grew snakes with clown faces. That'd be cool, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what happens.
Yeah. It's so true, doesn't it? It does feel a bit like they thought, do you know what else would look cool? Let's throw that in. And it does look amazing, this film, right? I mean, I think this film has a bit of a rep as being like a sort of bad B movie almost.
No, it's lush. It's really lush.
It's gorgeous, isn't it?
It is actually. The production design is out of this world. The physical effects is out of this world. The detailing is incredible. I mean, it does, like, it's the same guys who did, they didn't direct Critters. This is their only directing film, but they did the effects on Critters, and you can really see how those are kindred spirits.
Yes.
But the making is so beautifully done. It really, really is. I will say, I watched it on Blu-ray, which, thank you, Blu-ray. There were some zippers and that kind of stuff you ended up seeing. So I wouldn't seek out the
classic.
Blu-ray necessarily. But
yeah.
But yeah. It's spectacular. The colors, the vibrancy of it, there's real careful attention and care paid to the details in this film, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so such a cult favorite. Really, is the filmmaker's commitment to those details.
Yeah, 100%. It feels like it's made with love, and it really does look spectacular, I think. And like you say, it doesn't really matter about the story. You're kind of there for those really fun vignettes and set pieces, and it's just so colourful. It's like kind of candy for the eyes, isn't it? Almost, I think.
It really is. Well, and for good reason. It's in keeping with obviously the big top theme and that kind of thing. It is just a three-ring. I mean, it does exactly what it says on the tin. It couldn't be any more what it says on the tin if it tried.
It's so true. And let me ask you about that, actually. I mean, like you said that the plot sounds like something straight out of a 50s movie, doesn't it? It does feel like, and this is something we've talked about before with the 80s version of The Blob. There's been a lot of, like, almost like there's a kind of resurgence in the 80s in that kind of cyclical horror way where people are kind of bringing back the monster movies of the 50s a little bit. And this does feel like even the title, Killer Klowns from Outer Space, it starts with a song, like a kind of novelty theme song.
Oh, the song is so good.
So good. That really reminded me of The Blob. There is this real feeling of a kind of 50s homage almost, I think, isn't there, about this movie?
You can feel that, and it feels like these guys grew up loving like The Day the Earth Stood Still and all this kind of stuff. Like, it feels like that was their meat and potatoes as they grew up, and that this is their sort of homage to that. And it's everything. I think when you look at the film and you just think, oh, it's a B movie, then you miss the fact that they're doing these things intentionally in a lot of places. Yes. And I think once you realize that in many ways it's intentionally lo-fi, or the acting is intentionally camp, I think it sort of elevates what they're doing with the film.
Yeah. I think you put it alongside movies like The Stuff, The Blob,
exactly,
Stuart Gordon movies, maybe, that kind of thing, stuff that really pops off of the screen from this era, right, as well, and just is having so much fun. And yeah, I think they are very easily dismissed as like that's kind of like bottom shelf at your video store kind of B movie fare. But I was really impressed by just how good this movie looks and how well done it is, really, from beginning to end. And also, we've just this minute talked about on the podcast Peter Jackson's Bad Taste, which is also brilliant, and it's so well done, but it's got that much more kind of scritchy, scratchy, like almost home movie vibe to it.
It is lo-fi, it is definitely
that is seriously lo-fi, right? Whereas actually Killer Klowns actually does have a little bit more. It's got more of a spectacle, basically, hasn't it? I think it's much more of a feast for the eyes, which is lovely.
Oh, yeah.
So. Let me ask you about the clowns themselves, because
do we have to? Can we just skip this bit?
I know it is, and I've thought a lot about this. I've even made a video essay for the BBC about clowns and why we're scared of clowns. But what is it, in your opinion, Jen, about clowns. Why are clowns so fucking scary?
So it's, I mean, you probably, I must admit, I haven't heard your presentation on it, but it must, I'm sure it's the same conclusion you came to, because it's quite psychological and clinical, the reason they're frightening. It's two things. It's the elements of the uncanny, and then it's a masked figure. They're both uncanny as well as masked. And what that means, uncanniness, a lot of people will have heard of the uncanny valley, which is something in animation where, the closer something gets to looking human, the less comfortable we are with it until it gets to sort of almost human and we instantly become really uncomfortable with it.
Yes.
What was it? I always reference it, the Tom Hanks Trains movie.
Yeah, me too. Polar Express. That's like the prime example, isn't it?
Of uncanny valley. So whenever things are not quite right, they set off a really instinctive alarm in our minds and our amygdala that makes us say, ooh, what's wrong with this? Why is this wrong? And it's anthropological, really. It's from everything to keep us from mating with someone who might have a disease to, being wary of injury, to all these kind of things. And clowns, like the big hands, the weird hair, the white skin, all of that is uncanny. And then you get the elements of masking. Now, the reason that masks frighten us is because they cover the unknown, right? It's not so much the mask, it's what's behind the mask. And you'll find that the more seemingly harmless or innocuous a mask gets, the bigger the distance between the audience's concern about what's underneath it. So with clowns, what's harmful about a clown? It's, except unless you're me, which is frickin' everything. And these ones are particularly gnarly. In as much as they're quite bulbous, the skin is very heavily textured. There's a griminess to them, to the design of them, that's really upsetting. They've got these like chubby fingers that are like frightening and newt-like. But yeah, they're just no good, Mike. They're just no good.
They're no good. And there is a spectrum, and this is something I looked at, that there's a spectrum of kind of how human to how monstrous clowns can be, right? And I think, on the one end of the spectrum, you've got, for example, Captain Spaulding from House of a Thousand Corpses, where it's basically just a dude in some bad makeup, almost like Heath Ledger's Joker as well. Like it's kind of like smudged bad makeup, not like very, very human.
So really more the mask side rather than the uncanny side.
On the other end of the spectrum, you've got the killer clowns from outer space, where these are proper monstrous,
pointy teeth.
Yeah, and I think maybe the reason why Pennywise is so kind of one of the most kind of notorious is that that lies somewhere in between, I think, doesn't it? Where you, especially Tim Curry's one, where you think this is a guy who's seemingly friendly, who also has these monstrous features
as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It flips from being with Pennywise. He flips from being a guy, conceivably a guy in makeup, to a hellish demon at various points, depending on his powers or, extra reveals about the makeup or transitions or that kind of thing. Yeah. So you're right. I think he's sort of, and he's also singular. Like he's just one clown at that point, man. I can handle one clown, not an entire spaceship of killer clowns.
I know.
Too many clowns.
Too many clowns. There are so many of them. It's true. And isn't it just funny that they're like, they're supposed to be entertainers for kids, but I don't think I've ever known anyone who ever enjoyed clowns as kids. Like, I feel like there are more people that are terrified of clowns than people that enjoy clowns,
I think that must be true. But I must say, I remember my mom trying to book clowns for me as a kid and me just having none of it. We had I think he was sort of a franchised community TV character, but Bozo the Clown was a big deal when I was growing up, who had this like big rim of red hair, and like kids would go on his show and like toss ping pong balls into cups for prizes and this kind of nonsense. Couldn't watch that. That was not okay. But he looked a lot like Pennywise, actually. Oh my God, but yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because you know, you would never book a clown for an adult's party or a teenager's party.
No.
It's there's no interest there. But for tiny children, why not?
It's weird, isn't it? And
you cannot run and hide.
And there are those things that you associate with children that adults find scary. It's the same with dolls, right? I mean, how many countless horror movies are there about dolls? And that is, again, it's like it's something you associate with child's play, literally. And people are terrified of them in the way that they are clowns too, right? And again, there's that uncanniness, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose the corruption of innocence and that kind of stuff plays into it as well.
Yeah.
Is that something that's supposed to be harmless and should be harmless, and yet is so deathly and violent? Which is a lot of what this film plays with as well. Is that the clowns don't like chase anybody. Like, there's very rarely are the clowns in pursuit of any of the characters. More often than not, the clowns stumble up upon them, interact with them. The humans do something slightly sinister to deserve the clowns' wraith.
Yes.
And then the clown does a shadow puppet show where it turns its hands into a Tyrannosaurus Rex and they eat everybody at the bus stop.
Oh my God, yeah, that scene.
Standard.
That is a weird, and the tone of this film is weird, right? Like, is it supposed to be funny? Is it supposed to be scary, or both? I mean, because it is very kind of cartoony and wacky, isn't it, as well?
I definitely think it's fun and scary, and I think that's what they set out to do. Because when you look at things, well, you look at their other work, and like they did the puppets for Team America, so they've obviously got a sense of humor.
Yeah.
The Chiodo brothers, but then you look at things like Critters. Oh, they also did Ernest Scared Stupid, which that's, if you're not American, you might not know the Ernest series, but
I don't.
Ernest was a beloved American character who was sort of like a comedy redneck who got into hijinks and adventures, and there are all these different films, and the Scared Stupid one is their Halloween film. But that's a little piece of Americana you can check out for the non-US based listeners.
Oh, love it,
Scared Stupid, very like Troll, like very in that realm of things.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, so I think it has to be done with a sense of humor because they have a sense of humor, and even if you look at the cast they got in, I noticed the only cast member of note is a guy named Christopher Titus, who went on to have he's a stand-up comedian, had a career as a stand-up comedian in the States, and eventually got his own show called Titus. So I imagine, I have to think that the comedy is intentional. I don't think it could have landed as well as it did if it wasn't.
Yeah.
But I think, they just have that knack for making things freaky. And upsetting.
It is, and it's like it's a real skill to create something that is simultaneously funny and creepy at the same time. And there's a moment the one that gets me is the moment when a clown is just like waiting outside somewhere where there's a little girl, and he's just going like that with his finger,
beckoning
just
her
sort of
outside.
beckoning her outside. Like, that's proper creepy,
thank you.
kind of sinister, isn't it?
And she almost goes like her mom, like she's at the door and he's just waiting for her, this horrible clown. and her mom like snatches her back from the door. Where are you going? But then the parent has clearly not been paying attention to her. The mom is painted very much as not like as chatting with her friend and not paying attention to what the kid's doing. So yeah, there's that, and it does play with those sort of classic tropes. Like, that's a very like Frankenstein girl playing with daisies sort of moment. You're not sure if the clown is gonna actually do the murder on her or not. But then you've got the classic like necking in the car, everybody gets killed at makeout point kind of stuff, which is very box ticky again, but a great deal of fun.
Yeah.
And then you've got set pieces that you literally will never see in another film, such as the giant evil clown coming out from its roost, I think is the best word for it.
So good. What do you think of this group of characters? I mean, they're fairly disposable, right? But you've got these kind of teens, you've got the two ice cream van men, like kind of like pranksters. You've got the cop and some various other characters that come in and out of it. Again, it's not really a movie that particularly is concentrating on that side of it, right?
Yeah, I'd say the characters are deeply inconsequential for the most part. There's a little bit of B story with the fact that the cop and the ingenue used to date, and now she's with a new guy, but maybe she's not as into the new guy. But that never really goes anywhere. And then you've got the new guy is friends with the brothers, And that sort of male friendship bromance is actually probably the one that works most in the film, and how they relate to each other. But they definitely come off as like horrible creeps. I think that's one bit of the film that hasn't aged well, is how creepy those guys are and how pervy they are.
Yes.
And there's a real sex pest vibe, and I think at the time it was boys will be boys.
Yes.
But obviously as culture has shifted, thank God, we look at that as much more criminal behavior and less and less sort of charming male hijinks. So
true. It's so true. Yeah, that is always something that's going to age badly when it comes to these sorts of movies from this era in particular, right? But again, you don't really care. You just find yourself waiting for the next moment when you get, well, at least I do. I mean, you may be dreading it, but I'm just waiting for the next moment you're going to see something weird and colourful and wacky and clowny.
It was like the murders I'm fine with. It's genuinely every time a clown comes on screen, I would just be increasingly uncomfortable. So there's they have to have a clown car, obviously. And so I think that was the worst moment for me, was when clown after clown kept coming out of the vehicle, and it was less like how many, typical clown car, how many clowns are going to be in there, and more just me going, okay, enough clowns, clowns,
please, no more, no more.
And then you've got the bit, there's a sort of penultimate attack where our hero and heroine are nearly conquered by the clowns, and they're sort of climbing a colorful tower of blocks.
Oh yeah.
And all the clowns are circling around them and slowly creeping towards them. And it just, no thank you. Oh man. Just the words are not good. It's not good
amazing,
for me.
Isn't it? Like, you're right. The actual kills, for the most part, they're not particularly. They're mainly being shot by some sort of ray gun or laser gun, right? A lot of the time, or something.
Which is fantastic. The cotton candy gun, where it mixes like some brilliant 80s light effects with some. Probably real cotton candy. I can't, or fiberglass.
Yeah.
It was the 80s. Who even knows? But it's just so luscious the way that it works.
Know. And there is a bit of Alien in there, right? Ridley Scott's Alien, with the way that they are cocooned in those big cotton candy,
light bulbs,
chrysalis. Yeah, exactly. That stuff, and that is a genuinely quite weird, creepy moment when they sort of uncover one and they see that sort of bloodied face just hanging in this cotton candy. You're like, oh yeah, this is actually a horror film, Yeah,
you're forgetting the bit where the giant fat clown comes out with a giant silly straw and pops it into the cocoon and then drinks the person's bodily fluids.
Oh my god, yeah, like a
That's
milkshake.
upsetting.
It is upsetting. That's the thing, and like there are. But it's like you say though, it's the moments when you just see the clowns just standing there, like, or not doing much. Like they are the creepiest moments. The moment when the clown gets arrested, and put in the jail cell, and it goes on for a really long time before he decides to kill this policeman. But like that whole sequence where the clown just kind of stands there staring,
playing along.
Yeah, playing along. That is some of the creepiest stuff.
So here's something I want to ask. Speaking about the jail cell, and obviously not having watched this for 30 some odd years, the two, let's call them hoodlums.
Oh yeah, the two ne'er-do-wells. Yeah.
So I genuinely felt like they were coded as gay, like that they're just two gay guys who are out hanging out, and the cops are hassling them, and they're having to be like, look, we weren't doing anything. Come on, like it. And I don't know if that's just like my queerness or whatever, but for me, it really felt like quite intentionally. These were two gay guys who were being hassled by the cops, not two weirdos who were being hassled by the cops.
Do you know what? That didn't occur to me, but it makes sense now that you say it, because we don't really see those two do much, but we see them, all of the cops particularly, be like, you've ruined this, you're making this town worse, and blah 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 blah, like your types. Yeah, that's so true. I mean, like,
that's one for the audience members who haven't watched it yet. Maybe see what you reckon. I don't think I'm putting that on it, but it just very much occurred to me in the moment. But yeah,
I love it. I love it. And I think there is that, again, that something we talked about with the Blob remake, where it does kind of sort of comment on those sort of 50s values in the way that it's harking back to the 50s, but it's also kind of confronting that 50s-ness. And also, I suppose, the fact that there were, you know, America and Reaganism at the time that was kind of bringing back those 50s values, and it's almost pushing against that or subverting that in a way. You know?
I think it was. I really think it was. And it's you could see in their other work that they have that in them. So, there you have it.
I love it. I also love, and I know we've talked about it, but the production design is unbelievable.
Lush.
Love it. How much fun must it have been to be on this set? Because like the actual spaceship, the inside of it with the swiveling doors, and there's like the big like pit of balloons that they jump in at one point, but like there's that huge room with the ladders. I loved it. I think it's again lush, like you said.
And so much story and detail. Like no two spaces was the same. They did a very clever trick, which I had to message my production designer during the film and be like, haha, they did the same thing we did. Because the corridors are very clearly, which is an old spaceship trick to do when you're building spaceships for film, the corridor is built sort of like a Y, so that you can shoot it from any direction and have it appear to be different corridors back and forth. Except theirs was like Technicolor camo. I love the line, I recognize this hallway. I've been here before. Doy. Like, it's like, do you? That's really, you think? But yeah, every space was so unique. And there's even the ball pit, which turned out to be like a jacuzzi with the sexy lady clowns, who were not sexy and were like... You know, I just terrifying. The implication that the two guys in the van hooked up with the terrifying lady clowns. Why are the male clowns so aggressive if the lady clowns just want to get it on? Like, what's their deal? Are they mad because the lady clowns are freezing them out? I don't know. But it's such an incongruous element to the film. Suddenly these two guys just go off and shag the evil lady clowns. Off camera.
It's so true. I love it. The amount of fucked up films we've talked about together, Jen, and this is the most not okay I've seen you in talking about any other horror movie.
I'm really quite unsettled. I'm like, I keep sort of fidgeting and I really through the whole film I ended up getting Dan to watch it with me. He was going to be out of town, but I ended up getting him to watch it with me. And it really was, I held his hand at one point. It was really not okay. It was really like...
Is there one particular clown out of this group that scares you the most? Any standout clowns for you? I mean, I suppose that giant one at the end is pretty... the
giant one's pretty bad. The fat one really freaks me out. The giant Goliath-y fat one who does the human milkshake thing. But I'll tell you what it is. They all freak me right out, and it's genuinely, there's something about the like dirtiness of the texture of their skin and face, where like the wrinkles. I will say I have a real fear of foam latex creatures and this kind of thing. Yeah. So like Basket Case does me in. Like there's I can't remember what it's called, but there's a Chevy Chase movie with two like fat babies in a dump.
Oh my god. Sounds horrible.
Demi Moore, Chevy Chase, and it's these two big fat baby suits, and they're all sweaty and dirty, and it's that sweaty, dirty latex that really just unsettles me. So I wouldn't say it was any of the clowns necessarily in particular. And I sound really sizist because I said fat babies and fat clown. It's not about the size of it. It's just because that's how I think they're probably credited that way.
Yeah.
But it's really about the sort of texture of the skin that I find most unsettling. The hair doesn't bother me. The costumes, meh. But yeah, something about the weird gray, dirty wrinkliness of the skin just really gets under mine.
Yeah, like you say, those kind of sausagey fingers as well. There's something weird about those.
You don't want them to touch you. It's like a horrible, horrible uncle. It's like just really disturbing.
What is their MO? Is it that they're eating us? Right, they are, aren't they? Because of the milkshake straw.
Well, they're definitely eating us. I was
like, are they just coming to Earth to just kill people and then leave again? Basically.
I think somebody mentions this at one point. I think there's one of the characters pontificates on this very question, and as far as I recall, the characters determine that they're just basically stopping for a snack. before they go somewhere else. Because
we're like their like motorway service station.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like you go to the M&S, you get a human milkshake, you get back on the road. Make good time to Neptune.
Yeah.
But I think that's the other thing, is that it's not even personal. It's not even like it's quite passive. They're like the most colorful predators that have ever existed. I actually now want to see a Killer Clown and Predator mashup because I'm not sure how that would end. I'm really not sure how that would end.
I love that. Well, the odds are, right, I mean, I haven't checked, but the odds are Disney probably now own this film, so it probably could happen. It probably could happen. You know, we could get a crossover.
I'm super into that. The Predator covered in pink cotton candy, just like don't know what to do. Like he's doing his invisible mode, but it doesn't work because it writes itself, really.
It's so good. And I loved watching this movie having just watched all of the Alien films, because it was like the anti kind of H.R. Geiger kind of spaceship, but there were kind of similarities, right? Like we've talked about the cocoons and that kind of thing, but it was like, I love and this is what's so great, I suppose, like we discussed before about what's so great about the Alien subgenre or the sci-fi horror subgenre, is that these monsters can be so vastly different to each other.
It's huge.
But I love a horror movie that embraces its kind of primary color palette, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, and it really goes for it. And it's not just those sort of more modern alien references, contemporary alien references. I think that, you look at some of those spaces and it's got proper like old sci-fi, like Jacob's Ladder and electrical plasma balls and all that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot of really solid, just old sci-fi references in there as well. Mm-hmm. I really feel like, what on earth did anyone use a plasma ball before science fiction films? Like, why did they exist before? And I'm sure there's a scientist out there who could explain it. But as far as I'm concerned, they're set design alone.
Absolutely. That is something for sci-fi films, definitely. And so there you go. I mean, there's not a whole lot to discuss when it comes to Killer Clowns from Outer Space, right? It's all about the look, the vibe of this movie. But is there anything else you want to mention, Jen, before we wrap up? Any other highlights or any other particular elements of this film we haven't covered yet?
I think it's definitely a must-watch, I would say. And even if you're scared of clowns, I think it's worth... Especially if you're scared of clowns, I think it's worth suffering through, because it's more than people give it credit for, really. Like, it's a cult B movie, but I think because it is so off-kilter and so silly, a lot of people will dismiss the craft that comes with it. And yes. I think it's a misstep. I think, it's a film that should be looked at as people who love independent film and who love filmmakers who love what they're doing. It's very clear that these guys were loving every minute of being on set, even if it was a nightmare at the time. I can tell that there were grins of delight from someone on every scene.
I know. I thought that too. There's a moment when a character is just having pies thrown at them from off screen, and you can almost see the actor crack a smile at one point when this pie just flies from off screen into his face. But they must have had an absolute blast making this.
Well, and it's just and the logic behind it as well, because about 5 minutes later you see that all of the pies that have been thrown at this character have begun to dissolve him into a pile of a sundae that's then got whipped cream and a giant cherry on top. So it's just so irreverent at every turn. Like, these clowns do not give a fuck.
I know, right? And again, it goes back to that childhood nightmare thing where you almost imagine that, like, a child comes up with these ideas. And this is something me and Jamie Graham talked about with The Thing, where The Thing is so unbelievably indescribable in how it looks, right? It's almost like, ask a child to draw a monster and they'll draw something that looks like The Thing, that has tentacles and faces and eyes and teeth and, like, all that kind of thing. And it's almost like that with this, like when you think about, this person gets a cake on them and then they melt and then they put a cherry on top and they, I don't know, there's something about it that feels kind of childlike as well as deeply horrific, which is again where that kind of uncanniness comes from, I suppose, in a way.
Well, and there's also, and it's a similarity with The Thing as well, there's the juggernaut aspect of it, which is that they're just unstoppable. I mean, the sort of crux of it all is that they discover that if you destroy the nose, you destroy the clown. Yes. In a very zombie head wound kind of headshot kind of way.
Love it.
But before they figure this out, it seems like they're indestructible. And I think there is something just generally terrifying about that kind of juggernaut, that no matter what happens, there's nothing you can do about it, and eventually it will get you. They do this sort of Michael Myers slow walking after people. Like I said, they're not running in pursuit of you. They're not chasing you down and climbing, jumping on you and punching you. They are just stood there, and then they shoot you with a cotton candy ray gun.
Yes.
And that's the end of you. And then you get drunk like a milkshake.
Exactly. And yeah, and then, I guess it's really interesting. Like you said, I mean, we've touched upon this already, but the reputation this film has, right, is like a kind of so bad it's good film, I suppose, right? Do you think that's the case? Is that what this film is?
I think it's good. I think it's actually good. I understand why people want to defer to that descriptor, because it does fall into that B-movie category. But I think if you actually watch what they're doing, you can see the craft in it. Like, there's not a lot of holes in the craft, to be perfectly honest.
No.
It's like I said, the style of acting is not going to win any Academy Awards, but it is a style of acting rather than just being, quote, bad acting.
Yes.
And if you look at everything else, like the cinematography, the production design, the lighting, it makes sense as a film. It's not a badly made piece. No. It's just a piece that is intentionally stylistically made to look like a 50s B-movie.
Absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's so true. Speaking of, have you had a chance yet to see Malignant yet, Jen?
I haven't. No, I hear things. I'm avoiding information just because I've read a couple people saying avoid information and go into it.
Avoid information at all costs. But I'll be excited to hear what you think of that, because that's very much also embracing that B-movie thing where some people totally are on board with it and other people have gone, this is the worst movie I've ever seen in my life.
Are there clowns in it, Mike?
No clowns, Jen. I can confirm no clowns.
I can watch. I can't. Like, I will watch another clown movie at some point in my life, but not soon. Not today.
Not today. No. Give it a while.
Not like this.
Yeah.
Not like this, Mike.
Not today.
It wasn't meant to be like this.
It's so fun, and it is such a cult classic. I mean, even when I was doing research for this earlier today, I typed into Google "Killer Clowns from Outer Space," and the first result for me was Prince Charles Cinema listings, because here in London, it's playing in a couple of weeks' time, because it's still being shown.
What?
Yeah, just FYI, Jen, if you fancy seeing it on the big screen.
I'm both uncomfortable and strangely drawn at the same time.
Right? I know. But that's the thing. It is one of those movies. Like, it is a Prince Charles Cinema movie, isn't it? It's
super.
It's such a cult
favorite.
favorite.
It's Rocky Horror Picture Show, except Tim Curry isn't in it. Like, it's. I genuinely think if they had a slightly different cast who became the George Clooney's of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes or what have you, then I think that actually a lot more people would have seen this film and know about this film as a piece of like historical artifact. But it doesn't. It's, they've got Christopher Titus, and who knows who that is.
Exactly.
But yeah, I think it's got legs. It's got stamina. It's got staying power. I don't know if I'm giving a sports talk now or if I'm telling about, but it does. It's going to stick around. It's not going anywhere. And I think it was really interesting because obviously seeing it in the 80s, it was more contemporary then. But I would very much, if somebody born, let's say, a 20-year-old now watching it, I would be interested to hear what era they thought it was from. I don't think they'd think it was from the 80s. I think they would guess earlier.
You're right. It's got that weird, almost like that kind of Twin Peaks thing where it's made in the 80s, but it's sort of set in the 50s almost in the way it looks.
Yeah.
But also there's a sort of timeless quality to it as well. At the same time, you could almost believe someone made it now as a kind of homage or pastiche,
Exactly.
With that like 80s, craze that we've got
Stranger
at the moment.
Things.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? And that's why. And I think you're right, and I completely agree with you. I think other than the odd sort of slightly dodgy character moment or sexual politics moment in this film, it kind of holds up, right? It still works. Yeah.
It does, and I do think, like I said, there's for every moment where there's dodgy sexual politics, I do think there's other moments like the queer couple, being shown to be ostracized by the police. It's you're with them when it's being done. You're not against them when it's being done. So I think that for for every negative, there's places where there's positives as well. But yeah, thanks for making me do that.
I love it.
It was horrible.
I love it. I'm glad that you've been able to face your fear. Do you think you're ever going to revisit it again, Jen? You're going to give it another 20 years?
I don't know. Now I feel like people are going to ask to watch it with me because they know it freaks me out. And I'm like, I don't know. It just, and this is, you can really see how uncomfortable it makes me. Yeah. So I don't know. I like to think I can. I like to think that one day I will be brave enough to venture onto that particular bit of the shelf again, but I can't guarantee it. I can't guarantee I'm that strong, Mike. I don't know.
I take it Dan is probably not allowed to dress as a clown for any Halloween parties. You guys?
No, the thing is, Dan has been told that he's got one go at properly scaring the hell out of me, and he's not allowed to ever do it again after that. So
he's got to choose that moment carefully.
Yeah, because it's I just really early on in our relationship realized that if I didn't put a limit on that, then he'd end up the boy who cried wolf with some kind of venal injury. Because I just assumed I would just assume he'd done some kind of special effect when he'd actually be bleeding out quite badly from some kind of DIY injury, and I just step over him and not call the ambulance at that point. So he gets one, so that I don't lose all faith in upholding his health and safety from then on.
I love it. Well, that is totally fair enough. Yeah, amazing. Well, Jen, thank you so much for coming back and discussing this and dredging up this childhood trauma as well.
Well, thank you for having me.
I feel like you need to go and have a drink.
I'm gonna have a sugary tea. I think.
Yeah.
I think I need. I think I need a calming sugary tea to reset myself. But
exactly.
We'll see how it goes.
But until we next see you, tell us where people can find you out there online, and is there anything you've got coming up?
Okay, so it's actually, October is always a busy month, but this one happens to be busier than normal because I am programming the industry forum for Rain Dance Film Festival, which I'm very excited about.
That is exciting, yeah.
So we're playing in tandem with the festival from October 27th through to November 6th. And the program will be held at the pop-up, which is going to be called the House of Rain Dance, based on the Strand at number 11 Strand, where the Next used to be.
Yes,
retail's loss is cinema's gain. And we'll be holding not only over 40 plus panels and discussions, but we'll also be having our VR Strand will be based there, as well as some fantastic immersive installations, a little cafe for chatting. So it's going to be a real hub. And awesome. that's available. You can either buy all on the Rain Dance website. You can either buy passes for the duration of the event, or you can buy day passes if there's a particular day of programming that you're interested in. But yeah, so that's where I'm going to be, man. So come on down, come say hi, get involved.
Amazing. Jen, thank you so much for joining me.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. I'll see you soon.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my two brilliant guests, Jen Handorf, always a treat to have her here, and brand new guest, the brilliant Lucy O'Brien. Lucy, hopefully, will be back again for the next series. So, I would love to hear from you guys. What do you think of these two crazy 80s classics, Bad Taste and Killer Klowns? Let me know your thoughts. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. Don't forget, you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can also join the discussion group. That's called the Evolution of Horror Discussion Group, and you can find that on Facebook. You can find all previous seasons and episodes of this podcast on our website, evolutionofhorror.com. On our website, you'll also find our merch store, where you can grab yourself an EOH hoodie or t-shirt. That's evolutionofhorror.com/shop. You can find this podcast on all the normal podcast places, including iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, Acast, Libsyn, and Spotify. And if you get a chance, please do drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts, which really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and I'm very excited for next week. I've got one of my favourite guests discussing two of the most interesting films to come out of this era. Next week, we're going away from traditional aliens and more towards Lovecraftian cosmic horror. It's a real cosmic double bill next week. I'm going to be joined by my good friend Becky Dark, and we are going to be discussing Stuart Gordon's From Beyond from 1986, and then Paul W.S. Anderson's Event Horizon from 1997. What a mindfuck of a double bill. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.